Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first episode of Soldera Market Discussions. I'm joined by Al and Stenver from Soldera. Hi guys. It's good to be just discussing guarantees of origin and renewable energy certificates. First time in a podcast format for Soldera. It'd be good to get an introduction from both of you and a little bit of background on Soldera more generally. And then why don't we go into giving a high-level overview of the Go ecosystem for the viewers.
Yeah, thanks for inviting, Oliver. And I'm the founder and CEO of Soldera. I've been in the environmental asset space for more than 10 years. I have a technical background. I've done multiple companies in the space, everywhere from regen ag, where we help farmers become carbon farmers and help them create carbon credits, all the way to carbon credit trading platforms, and now Soldera, where we help producers remove all the compliance and administrative burden related to guarantees of origin and also their trading side as well. And I'm really into tech, into using AI solutions to solve all the issues we have and essentially making sure that all these systems that should be automated will be automated.
And Al.
And hi, I'm Al. By background, I'm a product manager and data scientist. Been working with Stenver for about a decade, solving a bunch of different environmental technological problems. It's been a great time, and currently we're working on this. So we're, as Stenver said, significantly simplifying how renewable energy producers approach guarantees of origin, how they manage their renewable energy, trying to get that down to having to do almost nothing. That's the dream, right?
For sure. So what does that currently look like? I mean, what are we simplifying for those who don't really understand what guarantees of origin are, or maybe they do, but all they know is it's something complex, right? What does that simplification process actually look like?
I'll quickly cover high level how they work, and then maybe Al can get into the nitty gritty details. So essentially, like, what are even guarantees of origin? I guess is a good place to start, right? So imagine at your home where you have a choice whether to buy regular electricity or renewable electricity. Then you may start thinking, like, how do they get those green electrons to my house in case of the renewable electricity? Well, the answer is they don't, because if you take power from the grid, it's like taking water from the ocean. Like, you have no idea where it came from. So to solve that issue, then on top of the electricity markets, they built the guarantees of origin market. And it simply proves that the electricity was from a renewable source. It works very simply. It's like accounting. Every megawatt hour you sell to the grid, government-related entities, usually the TSO, will give you one guarantee of origin, and on the other end, you buy it. But in order for you to get that, there's tons of bureaucracy, and we noticed that 30% of producers are not even utilizing that option. They just leave money on the floor in the EU.
And is it really as simple as not even, that these producers aren't aware, or is it more, I think they're aware, but it's too difficult for them?
It's there's just too much bureaucracy, or they're not aware. It's either of those two. And even if you do get through the bureaucracy, whenever you go doing deals, you need to do like KYC stuff. That's another layer of complexity. The bigger you get, the more KYC burden you have, all the deal making. Everything about it is like, it just sort of takes time. And at the same time, the market access for them is limited as well, because if you're too small, nobody wants to bother doing this with you because it's just not worth their time or effort.
So what do you see the current stage of the guarantee of origin ecosystem being right now, especially as someone who's trying to build a startup in it, an intense regulatory environment? It'd be great to get your insights here as well, Al. That seems like a daunting task for a lot of people, but it's something that you two just see a problem that needs solving, right? So because he has some thoughts.
Yeah. So on a very high level, guarantees of origin are regulated by the Renewable Energy Directive in Europe. So that's kind of like a pan-European Union thing that just exists and is implemented a bit differently in each country. But ultimately, guarantees of origin are this kind of cross-border phenomenon, right? Like, you can move it anywhere, you can consume it anywhere within the European Union. It's ultimately like all the same guarantee of origin. Now, when we get into the nitty gritty of exactly how it works country by country, there are like major differences. Sometimes in what kind of documents do you need to issue? Do you need to do anything like on a monthly basis? For example, report the amount of electricity you're producing directly for reasons. There can be audit requirements. You need to go to a certain auditor, get like a stamp of approval that yes, this renewable energy device is real, even though it's clearly connected to the grid and it's producing something.
Every 5 years. Yeah, that 100 megawatts is still there. It hasn't left anywhere.
Yeah, it hasn't left. Like, definitely real. Sometimes it does get a bit goofy, but like this bureaucracy is different from country to country. But ultimately, everybody's kind of trying to do the same thing. Like the rails are the same. The specific implementation is a bit different, and managing that is just kind of a varying degree of a hassle depending on which country you're in. But ultimately, everything is manageable since governments like standardizing things. Like there are forms, there are procedures to doing everything. And what we've really drilled down on is how do we streamline everything for the producer? How do we make it as simple as possible? How do we make it so you don't have to do all of these things? We just handle the complexity in the background after you give us a couple of documents. That's ultimately the vision.
Tell them about the German example.
The German example. So in Germany, there are multiple degrees of guarantees of origin. So there are obviously the international guarantees of origin, which you can import into the country and then consume in the country. There are also regional guarantees of origin, which inside of Germany essentially are a different registry, but they ultimately fill the same goal and you can't get both. There's essentially like a regional tag of, hey, this is a guarantee of origin, super real. And then on top of everything else, there's essentially this fact that if you get some sort of a state subsidy, you can't get guarantees of origin, but that's claimed by the balance responsible party. Whoever is like trading your electricity has to just kind of keep track of that and also manage that. And like they can display that this part of my electricity is green from essentially paying out those subsidies. So there's kind of like multiple layers to this. And once you get beyond the 20 years of getting a subsidy, you have to move into the other system. So now you're getting guarantees of origin instead of a subsidy. And it becomes like kind of this like mess to keep track of, like what exactly is happening. And the best part, in some situations, you can move in and out of getting guarantees of origin and not getting guarantees of origin, depending on perhaps the market conditions are a bit better this time. So we'll use the market conditions.
The electricity price, basically,
Yeah, and when it comes to actually declaring the volumes, like for every production device, one by one, you essentially have to like type in an SMS code every time you want to get guarantees of origin. So like all of this together kind of creates this long list of just like random steps you have to do and things you have to think about to even get them. And if you consider that from an electricity producer's perspective, this makes up maybe 5% of their revenue. It can be a very important part of the profit margin, but if it makes up 5% of your revenue, you don't want to do this full time. That's not like your core business, right?
Yeah, you want to put less than 5% of the resources there. And, we've visited producers in Germany, and some of them have like people whose only job is to literally just verify the monthly volumes with SMSs. They like literally enter the data, imagine like this Windows 95 style. You enter the data in essentially that, and then every device needs their own form fill, and then you have to verify it on your mobile phone by SMS. And Soldera just automates all of it. Like it's done.
Quickly, just bringing the conversation back to geography-specific guarantees of origin. Explain how that relates to importing and exporting different guarantees of origins. Yeah, I know it's hard to speak generally in a market where everything's so complex and diverse, but is it easy to say that those goals are constrained to that particular geography, or can they be switched into the international type that can be then sent elsewhere?
It depends. Another good example of this is Sweden. So in Sweden, they also have this internal guarantees of origin system and an external guarantees of origin system. So if you want to export it to other countries, you need to fill out special paperwork. And now you're getting a different kind of certificate compared to the internal one, which usually is like small producers, people that put less time into it, like they get the internal one. Big producers get the external one. It's worth more. It's kind of like, again, a bit random like that. They're used for slightly different things sometimes, but ultimately you need to fill out like an additional layer of paperwork and then you can get the external ones. In almost every country in Europe, though, you can just get the guarantee of origin as regulated by the Renewable Energy Directive and export that, import that, do whatever with it. There are no major limitations in most places. But for example, if you're in Spain and you receive subsidies, you can't export, but you can use internally. Like there are these kind of small rules everywhere you need to keep track. But it's a bit different from country to country on when exactly can you import, when exactly can you export. But ultimately, the principle behind it tends to be, were they produced by complying with a similar set of requirements and constraints? Ultimately, that's what it comes down to. If it's a bit different in like another country, it might not be considered equivalent. But in Europe, generally, all of the guarantees of origin in each country are interoperable. So if you are, for example, in Germany, you can use Estonian guarantees of origin. Like, that's not a problem.
And does it relate to connectivity and Sandra, like the transmission itself? Is distance a challenge? Because I guess the end goal of a fully functional Go market is that anybody can purchase renewable energy that's then being serviced to them from anywhere else. But I guess, what are the actual physical constraints?
I guess you need to consider this fact that guarantees of origin are traded separately from like the physical electricity. So when a guarantee of origin in Estonia gets exported to Germany, the electron doesn't necessarily like follow the same trajectory, right? Generally, people have large organizations that use guarantees of origin have certain limitations, like it needs to be connected in like a viable way, the place where you're buying guarantees of origin from and the place where you're consuming them in. So, for example, you couldn't use Icelandic guarantees of origin in Germany. That would be a bit weird. It's still done right now, and that's a bit problematic, but essentially, guarantees of origin and the physical electricity are not connected. But there's this important thing we need to talk about, which is called the residual energy mix. And this is like super relevant when it comes to guarantees of origin, because that's the main thing that it affects. So if you are in a country that has, let's say you're in Germany, a lot of your electricity, like physically, still comes from fossil fuel sources, right? You're burning fossil fuels. And ultimately, what guarantees of origin kind of do is that it spreads this out into other countries. So you essentially say, hey, Estonia, or hey, like Lithuania, I like that you're producing this much renewable energy. I'm essentially going to like on paper import this into my own country. And in exchange, you're essentially getting the remainder of what is left over in my country after I have consumed the guarantees of origin. So there is this kind of equalizing system. That's why we need this concept of a renewable energy mix, which is everything that is left over after consuming guarantees of origin. So there is this kind of exchange between countries. It's evened out, it's kind of complicated. But ultimately what it results in is, hey, I got clean energy, and everybody that isn't consuming guarantees of origin, they essentially got what was left over.
There's also, so the entire guarantee of origin market is regulated by an organization called AIB, and they have been creating these European level directives to guide the market and standardize the market. One of the directives that they're working right now on is RED III. And actually, it does have a lot of references towards moving like more localized systems. So you can only use the guarantee of origin within the same country. I guess that's a separate discussion if that's a good idea or a bad idea.
So the AIB's role in guarantees of origin is essentially they work as this standardizing body of like getting the nitty-gritty details that aren't written in the European directives, getting those agreed between countries and getting that fully interoperable. So they kind of function as this bridge between countries, so you could move things in and out in like an easy and very technically simple way. Because otherwise you would need to essentially call Germany and go like, hey, I have some stuff in like the Estonian registry. Would you please like mark that somebody has consumed them? I'll cancel them over here. And then that gets really messy. And instead, there's kind of this system of like, okay, I exported it here, I'm importing it there. Like, we're still keeping track of it like across multiple registries. But ultimately, they set these standards of the nitty-gritty details of what is a guarantee of origin, like how is it managed, like what exactly does it look like, what kind of documents do you need to provide the public about how this registry works. These kind of things are generally defined by the AIB, while the European Commission essentially defines the high-level stuff of what exactly is the goal, where are we going, what kind of systems do we want. That's more something happening on the European Union level.
This is why we have Al in our teams.
I'm curious, you said that there's kind of like a shift towards this more local consumption model. Do you think they're going to encounter friction when it comes to, for example, in the German case, where regional governments are kind of guarantees of origin as something that are at odds with subsidies as a sort of reward or like a compensation method, whereas the broader trend is that there is a market being created here. So how are those things going to be resolved, do you think?
Quite a lot of different things to discuss about that exact same thing. The German market and most markets actually that have this system of if you get a subsidy, you don't get guarantees of origin, they're discussing a lot moving into still giving out guarantees of origin, because some countries are doing like there's simply a tag on every kind of guarantee of origin if it's with support or without support. So like German producers are literally losing out because in their country, they don't get guarantees of origin marked with support. And the price difference on the market, while there is some price difference, like a few cents to 10 plus cents or something like that, it's usually not that big. And like it's really like hurting the local producers, and all of those governments that are seeing that are noticing that and are like, why aren't we capitalizing on this opportunity, basically?
Yeah, generally what you see in countries that don't limit this, they simply, when we're doing the calculations of how much subsidy should I pay you, they just factor in that, hey, guarantees of origin have like a specific kind of value. I can just subtract that from the payment. You can have your guarantees of origin, like everything makes sense. That just makes it so all of your electricity is more trackable without creating these kind of parallel systems and creating like more tracking mechanisms for, hey, like what's the composition of my electricity? Usually that's kind of the reason why it ends up playing out this way is, hey, I don't actually want to manage like this market mechanism. You can have it. I'll just keep that in mind when I'm calculating what exactly is like a good subsidy pay to still motivate renewable energy producers to keep building new renewable energy production sites.
So before we get into another regulatory debate as to, I mean, whilst it seems quite obvious that the renewable energy producers should be able to sell GOES as well as getting subsidies, I think it's a good way to get into the conversation of how does the market actually decide what is, preferential, what is preferable, sorry. And because, Stenver, you mentioned that there's price differences between GOES with support and GOES without support. So yeah, let's talk about, how does the market decide?
Well, a big chunk of the market, a large part of it is driven by voluntary demand, right? So it's either ESG or people switching to that type of power. So there's a lot of brokers and traders out there. And when they speak with these end consumers and buyers, some of them have more stringent requirements, and they're like, we'll only buy guarantees of origin, which are unsupported, and for plants that are less than 5 years old, because we want our money to directly incentivize construction of new plants. And then there's other players in the space who are more like, we just want our power to be green. We don't really care about the details. And that's how the demand on a large part comes from. Now, I can't speak about specific subsidies because there is compliance demand on the market as well. In Estonia, for example, if you buy an electric car, you get the subsidy from the government. But you only get that subsidy if you start using renewable energy going forward every year. Now, this subsidy specifically, for example, doesn't have any requirement. So basically, that's on the bucket of use whatever you want, just make sure it's green. Because it's like green subsidy. So that's really how the different demand sources come from. And then there's some like super innovative players like Google, for example, who want to have hourly tracking. Because right now the guarantee of origin, it works like for 12 months. From the moment it's created to the moment where you have to consume it. Otherwise it's simply taken away and like destroyed. You have 12 months. And this is another topic that's a longer discussion, but like currently you can use a guarantee of origin like solar electricity produced in summer during the winter, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but it does make the market simple. So, it allows the market to grow. Like if you want to invent an iPhone, you don't start with the iPhone, you start with Nokia, right? So like you have to like build up to it. But some companies are very forward looking. So they're already doing this hourly matching. So they only buy guarantees of origin, which are created in the same hour that was also done where the consumption took place, basically.
So you touched on the shift to hourly GO consumption. What does that currently look like? I know it's a regulatory target, so people want to get there eventually. I mean, that's going to be pushed. But are people already doing that voluntarily? Is the onus on the producer to sort that out? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's actually very hard to do right now. Like, there's not a lot of like compliance options to do it. There's 4 countries or 5 countries that are like leading into trying to test it. Estonia being one of them, and Belgium, and so on. I think Netherlands was as well, and even Dutch. Yeah. So some of the countries are like experimenting with it, but it's expected to come like in 27, 28 timeframe, something like that. And a lot of people in the space are even like skeptical that we'll get it so soon. But you can still do it. There's companies out there, like technology companies, that specialize on doing it and sort of build their own trusted body on top of the governmental body. And they do the hourly matching, and they map it back to the specific monthly credit that the government has given out. It remains to be seen if any of those play will succeed or not. We're definitely very excited about that. We very much like to see innovation, and having been in the carbon credit space, we've definitely seen our share of like greenwashing and stuff. So we want to make sure that this market is very legitimate, and we're very supportive in whatever makes sure that the quality keeps going up and up, essentially.
But yeah, long story short, in the newest version of the European Renewable Energy Directive, they essentially wrote like, hey, it would be very cool if you all could start looking in this direction and like figuring it out. Like, that is something we're interested in. But there wasn't a lot of push other than, hey, please start looking at this. If you're a government agency that manages these things, please like start looking. That's essentially the phase we're in with these kind of things right now. There's a couple of pilot tests, and there are obviously technology companies that actively specialize in this. But ultimately, what we saw working in the voluntary carbon space was, if you have private companies doing it, it's a very fragile market, because the moment the trust gets eroded in some sort of a private entity, you have market collapse, right? If you have a government managing the trust layer, or, I could trust that this was produced on this hour and this was consumed on this hour. If that's managed by a government, generally the trust problem is solved by the government having to act in a very trust-worthy manner. Otherwise, they have like much worse consequences for themselves that generally private companies doing these kind of things don't experience. Yeah, we're currently in this kind of phase where, as Stenver mentioned, there are multiple countries looking at piloting some kind of solutions. There isn't like necessarily a standard just yet. There's more a couple of experiments of how can government registries be retrofitted or upgraded to support hourly guarantees of origin. But ultimately, the issue comes down to just how much more data, how much more infrastructure you need to manage this kind of a thing compared to the monthly issuance option, which is the standard right now, where at the end of every month, you essentially get the guarantees of origin for the electricity you produce that month. That's it. Like, that's the whole complexity for them right now. It moves out, it gets consumed, who cares? If you get on an hourly basis, now you need to be like, okay, every hour gets printed out as a separate certificate. Somebody needs to send it. Somebody needs to consume it. We need to have negotiations on what exactly is a guarantee of origin worth if it was produced 3 in the morning by some sort of a wind farm when there was no sun and we didn't really need heating, right? So like, essentially the supply and demand curves are going to get very similar possibly to the electricity market, and that doesn't, at the current prices, seem like a really good way to go. It's a lot of complexity, but we need to figure out how do we actually solve that in a manner that's going to make sense for everybody.
I also think that it's really good that these private companies and tech companies are doing this experimentation, because, so I mentioned in the beginning, like both me and Al's background is in environmental asset space. We've seen carbon credits, we've seen the good sides, the bad sides, and so on. But one thing that we definitely have seen is that the private companies have sort of done the experiments and led the way and set the standards and figured out all the quirks. And the nations that are currently adopting these carbon frameworks are basically all inspired by what these non-profits or carbon companies have been doing. Hopefully, they'll also take the learnings of what they've been doing wrong. We'll see. But the power markets are way easier than carbon markets in almost every sense possible to be when it comes to the green part, the guarantee of origin part. And like I think it will be like very easy to take all of these learnings and essentially adopt them in a regulatory framework.
That was going to be my next question, actually, is obviously, it's not the case of policy reacting to innovation or innovation reacting to policy. It's like a dance between the two, right? And they're working in tandems with obviously a lot of the controversies that have and obviously the benefits and impressive outcomes from the carbon markets that we've seen. Do you think there's a direct learning opportunities, and do you think they're being taken on board?
Yeah, absolutely. Like one of the example is, for example, the Japanese carbon markets. So if you look at the Japanese carbon markets, it's been like almost exactly copied from the voluntary carbon markets, and then just put some more regulatory stringent requirements on top of it, which is good because like one of the things carbon markets definitely need is like oversight. I think it's been made abundantly clear by now by many different experiments we've seen over there. And in the guarantees of origin market, you see the same. Like we've also approached and talked with a few of the TSOs and asked if they're interested in experimenting with hourly based geos together with us. And they've always been like very interested, and they appreciate the private sector showing like its head as well and taking the initiative on this front.
The thing that the carbon market generally struggles with is defining what real is. Essentially, let's say you plant a forest and we give you carbon credits for it, right? There's a lot of math and assumptions that go into figuring out, what's 1 ton of CO2 equivalent? And when should I give it to you? And what exactly are the properties that we agree on that, this is now real? Like, what needs to go into that? While in the renewable energy world, ultimately what you just need, assuming there's essentially government monitoring of what's going in and out, you just need a meter that tells you how much electricity is going out of this production site, and that's all you need, right? Ultimately, that's your ground truth, that's your evidence that the electricity that's getting put on the grid is green, because we measured the thing putting electricity onto the grid. The electrons were functionally counted, and we know that, hey, this amount is now on the grid, everything's good. In the carbon world, you don't really have that, and that's actually where a lot of the complexity comes from, where a lot of the problems come from. I think the most complicated area for renewable energy ends up being this subset called biomass. So essentially, there are these kind of cogeneration plants and just electricity generation plants that essentially burn some sort of biomass to get electricity and or heat. So that's kind of a bit more complicated, because while we can just look at the wind blowing and go like, okay, this wind turbine clearly produced wind electricity from wind and it went onto the grid, or with solar energy, we can just go like, hey, the sun is shining, it hit the photovoltaic panel, we got electrons, they moved onto the grid, everything's solved. Like, as long as that's, figured out, it's good. But when we get to biomass, generally in biomass, you see a lot more complexity, because we need to understand what exactly are you burning? Like, what went into it? Is it truly renewable? Like, what makes sense in that context? So this is like an ongoing discussion in renewable energy space. And I think that's the closest thing we have to like a carbon-ish problem. Because it's a bit more nuanced, the conversation of where exactly is like the real energy, what exactly qualifies, and how is this monitored? Because clearly we can't just look at the electrons and we can't just look at the wind and the sun. We have to consider, hey, you like logistically got a bunch of like woody biomass into this turbine. Where did that come from? Does that make sense to say that it's renewable? Should you get guarantees of origin for that? That's like a major thing that every government currently has like a much more complex procedure for, to figure out if they should get guarantees of origin.
I don't know if you actually knew, but guarantees of origin were under greenwashing fire as well before the regulatory frameworks came in prior to 2019 or 18. And there were some major scandals, and a lot of them actually revolved around exactly what Al just described.
Yeah, and that's ultimately why biomass facilities need they need to fill out a form. There needs to be occasional audits. Somebody needs to look at it. They need to check the logistics, make sure what you're claiming makes sense. There's a lot more procedure there. While for wind turbines, we can essentially go like, there doesn't seem to be anomalies. You're just producing wind energy. What we're observing makes sense. And that's essentially all we need.
So when there's more capacity for sort of doubt or human error, does that also get reflected in pricing? So where does biogas rank in terms of, price?
Biomass, specifically. Biogas is its own certificate. So biogas kind of exists as a parallel market to the renewable energy market. It's its own can of worms.
My next question was going to be, how does the increasing trend towards energy storage play into this, right? Do they count as production devices? Does energy discharged from storage, is that eligible for GOES? Do you think it should be? What's happening there?
Storage is kind of this hot topic when it comes to how that should be managed in terms of guarantees of origin, and there isn't a coherent narrative on that actually just yet, because storage has largely been this thing that's been developed and has evolved a lot in the past couple of years. Many of these protocols about guarantees of origin were written a couple of years ago, and they just haven't fully caught up just yet. There are many examples of how storage is handled, and generally the answer is they don't participate in the guarantees of origin system right now. Essentially anything that you put into your storage device and put out of the storage device, that's just essentially whatever is on the grid. There is no way to take a guarantee of origin produced 1 month and spit it out in the next month. Sadly, that's not a thing. I think it would create a lot of value, especially in the hourly market once we get there, if we had something like this, because then you could essentially move solar energy into the night, which would be very cool. We don't necessarily have that complexity in the system just yet. And generally, storage devices do not actively participate in either generating or storing guarantees of origin.
It would cause especially this precision will cause a lot of interesting arbitrage opportunities and make battery and storage investments a lot more attractive actually, right? Because you can suddenly get paid for, on top of taking the power arbitrage, you also can optimize it together with the guarantee of origin. But it really needs more automated systems, which we're working on.
It would be very cool for storage to get more integrated into how everything comes together right now. But essentially, it would be very cool if storage was more tightly integrated into guarantees of origin. Currently, it's not really. It's very peripheral to it. It just kind of exists on the side. But if we're going to move into this hourly model, it's going to create a lot of new interesting opportunities. And we're super excited about that. The opportunity to move solar energy into 5 a.m. is pretty cool.
So what are the current state of the markets, I guess, from the people who are listening, who are interested in the financials and the market movement of this? And I guess we did name this Soldera market discussions. So we should take a final moment to just reflect on the current state of the market.
Oh, the markets have been disappointing for a lot of people this year, especially since last summer, some peak deals happened at 10 euros per megawatt hour. And this summer they were €1. And now if you look at 2024, it's less than 50 cents. So it's had a massive drop. But what has been very interesting and has changed is the forwards. So historically, if you do a back testing and look at if you lock up your forwards versus if you had just sold a spot all the time, you can actually see that you would have made less money being in forwards. But when the drop happened, this flip. And for last year or so, you've actually had really good forward deals where you can get up to 2 or 3 times better results by locking yourself in the forwards. Yeah, the market seems to be a bit starting to rebound, but there's a lot of oversupply from 2024. And we still have this big player, the Italian government, who kind of crashed the market initially because they just kept on failing the auctions. They failed their auction again in September. So that was oh man. And so we actually onboarded a lot of our producers to take the forward opportunities and worked out automated systems, how to make sure that you always get the best deals in forward as well. Not in risky bets when to sell, but actually market average and spreading the risk out throughout the time. That's what we really propagate. In general, it's very hard to see how the markets move. It's super volatile. You see 10x movements. It's like crypto, So it's very, very volatile market. And power markets in general have been super volatile in Europe, right? For the last few years. So in that situation, serious companies with big capexes, you want to have certainty. So it's really about how do I manage this risk? How do I make sure this income is spread out throughout time, instead of trying to bet on buying or selling at the right time. So that's what we really specialize on as well.
And I guess to talk about like the oversupply and why are we in an oversupply situation, the interesting thing to know about the guarantees of origin market is the biggest exporter is Norway. So they export a lot of guarantees of origin into the rest of the European market. And that's essentially because they have a huge amount of hydro. And there hasn't historically been this drive to actually use and claim all of this hydro within Norway. So they end up kind of selling it out into other countries. And other countries essentially get flooded by hydroelectricity guarantees of origin. There's been a couple of very good years when it comes to rain. Currently, the aquifers are in the best state they've been in for a while, meaning they have very good levels of energy stored up to get released at whatever is the most opportune time. And they've been generating a lot of electricity that just essentially gets translated into more and more depressed guarantees of origin prices. There essentially was a drought a while ago that caused the huge price hikes, and everything seems highly correlated right now with the Norwegian electricity production. This hopefully will get changed since there are more reasons to consume guarantees of origin coming in over time. And Norway will participate in at least some of them, and that will likely reduce the amount of exporting happening from Norway, likely boosting the prices by just, cutting down on the supply entering the market.
So yeah, we can maybe wrap it there. It was a really good discussion. We touched on the complexities of the market in general, and then, final concluding thoughts about, Norway and the Italian government as well. Yeah, thanks for that, guys. And thanks, Stenver, now. And catch us in the next episode.
Perfect. Bye.